Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be tackling, those conversations that we all dread, the ones that we walk by, we're like, I need a nap and a stress ball,
Yeah.
the crunchy ones. So we've got this presentation here that is focused on helping neurodivergent professionals navigate these conversations. And what I think is really cool about this is it goes beyond just what to say. It really gets into the how-to of how to actually regulate yourself during these interactions. And I think this is such a game changer for neurodivergent folks.
Absolutely. I think that, what's so great about this is it's not just about having, the perfect script or the perfect thing to say, but it's really about understanding what's happening in your brain and your body and having those tools to stay grounded when things get intense.
Okay, so let's unpack this. So the presentation starts by talking about the neuroscience of crunchy conversations. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so imagine this. You're about to have a conversation with your boss about a project that's not going well. Or maybe you need to give a colleague some tough feedback. And immediately your brain might perceive that as a threat. And your amygdala, which is like the emotional center of our brain, it kicks into high gear.
So that's where that feeling of like panic or anxiety comes from.
Exactly. It's like a little alarm bell going off in your brain. And it triggers this whole cascade of physical changes. Your heart rate speeds up, your muscles tense, you might even start sweating. It's essentially like the fight or flight response kicking in.
Yeah, it's so funny because it's like our body is preparing us for some kind of like physical confrontation when really it's just a conversation.
Right. And for neurodivergent individuals, these responses can be even more pronounced. The presentation really highlights how sensory sensitivities and overload can amplify these reactions, making it even harder to stay regulated.
Yeah, so if you're already dealing with the stress of, having to have the conversation itself, and then you have this added layer of, sensory overload and all of that,
Yeah,
it's no wonder that these situations can feel so overwhelming.
exactly. And here's the key takeaway. When we're in this heightened state of stress, our executive function, which is that part of our brain responsible for clear thinking, decision-making, emotional control, it takes a hit.
Oh, so it's like our brain's like control tower is temporarily out of commission.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why we might, say things we regret or have trouble finding the right words, or even just freeze up completely. It's not that we're not capable, it's that our brain is prioritizing survival over those higher level functions.
Interesting. So knowing all of this, how do we actually get better at handling these crunchy conversations, especially when it feels like our brain and our body are kind of working against us?
Well, the presentation offers this fantastic framework. It's called Prepare, Present, Reflect. And it provides these practical steps to manage these conversations more effectively.
Okay, I like that. That sounds very structured and actionable.
Yeah. So the first phase, prepare. It focuses on setting yourself up for success before you even step into the conversation.
Okay, so what does that look like? Like, are we talking about like practicing our lines or like scripting out the entire conversation?
Not exactly. It's more about creating the right internal environment for a successful conversation. And they highlight the importance of pre-conversation regulation.
Pre-conversation regulation.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
So it's all about getting yourself into a calm and grounded state before the conversation even begins. Remember those physical changes we talked about earlier, like the fight or flight response? Well, physical movement can actually help complete that stress cycle
Oh.
and bring your nervous system back into balance.
Hmm. So are they saying that we should like do a quick workout before we head into a meeting?
Not necessarily. Even a brisk walk around the block or some light stretching, or even just a good cry can be surprisingly effective. The key is to engage your parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for calming your body down.
Oh, so it's like hitting the reset button on your nervous system.
Yeah,
Yeah, I could see how that would be really helpful, especially for neurodivergent folks who might be more prone to, feeling overwhelmed or overstimulated.
absolutely. And alongside the physical regulation piece, the presentation also emphasizes the importance of addressing any unmet needs that might be impacting your ability to regulate.
Set needs.
Yeah, they actually use this acronym, HALT. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. It's like this quick self-check-in to ensure that you're not heading into the conversation feeling depleted or
I
dysregulated.
love that. HALT. It's so simple, yet so powerful.
Yeah.
I know for me personally, like if I haven't eaten in a while, my fuse tends to be a lot shorter.
Yeah.
And if I'm exhausted, forget it.
Right. And it's not just, those basic needs. They also talk about the importance of being aware of your sensory environment. Are you wearing clothes that are tight or uncomfortable? Are you feeling too hot or too cold? These things can significantly impact your ability to stay regulated.
Yeah, it's like setting yourself up for success
Right.
by paying attention to all of these like little details that can make a really big difference in how you feel. I never really thought about it that way before.
It can be a game changer. And then the final piece of this prepare phase involves some introspection. The presentation suggests reflecting on your fears and desired outcomes for the conversation. They even provide some specific questions to guide you in this process.
Like what kind of questions?
Things like, what are your biggest fears about this conversation? What's the best possible outcome you can imagine? How do you want to show up in this interaction? And taking the time to answer these questions can really help you clarify your intentions and approach the conversation with more confidence and clarity.
I love that because it's so easy to get caught up in those anxious thoughts and kind of lose sight of what we're actually hoping to achieve.
Right. And that clarity is essential for staying grounded and regulated during the conversation itself. Which brings us to phase 2 present. So we've prepped ourselves physically and emotionally, we've identified our fears, we've clarified our goals, now we're kind of in the hot seat. What are some practical tips for staying regulated during the conversation itself?
Yeah, that's the part I always struggle with. It's like, I can feel calm beforehand, but
Yeah.
once that conversation starts, it's like all bets are off.
I hear you. And that's why this present phase is all about staying connected to yourself. You know your body, your emotions, your needs, even when things start to feel tense. And the presentation actually recommends this acronym, BREATHE, to kind of guide you during the conversation.
Breathe.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
So each letter stands for a key element. Be present, respond, don't react, empathize, authentically connect, take your time, and hold space for yourself and the other person.
Okay, I love that. Breathe. Like a little mantra to keep you grounded. But in the heat of the moment, it's so easy to forget all about, mindful breathing and thoughtful responses. So are there any other like specific techniques that can help us stay regulated when things start to get tricky?
Absolutely. One thing they highlight is actually, they call it HALT, which stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired.
Oh, didn't we talk about hold tea in the prepare phase?
We did. But it's worth revisiting here in the present phase, because sometimes even if we've addressed those needs beforehand, they can kind of creep back in during the conversation.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's like a continuous check-in with yourself. So if you start to notice any of those hold signals kind of popping up during the conversation, what do you do?
Well, it might mean, taking a pause, excusing yourself for a moment to grab a drink of water, or even suggesting a short break if you're feeling yourself getting overwhelmed.
Okay, what about those times when the other person says something that just pushes your buttons? How do you prevent yourself from like reacting defensively or saying something that you'll regret later?
That's where those breathing techniques that we talked about become crucial. Even just taking a few deep breaths can really help, slow down your heart rate and create a little space between, the stimulus and your response. The presentation also emphasizes the importance of body awareness, noticing where you're holding tension and consciously relaxing those muscles.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of us, and especially neurodivergent folks, we don't even realize we're doing. We're so focused on the conversation itself that we forget to kind of tune into our bodies.
Exactly. And sometimes simply acknowledging what's happening internally can be really helpful. You could even say something like, oh, I'm noticing I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed right now. Would it be okay if we took a quick break?
That's a great tip. Being honest and transparent, both with yourself and with the other person.
Right. And remember, taking a break isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength and self-awareness.
So speaking of self-awareness, the presentation also talks about the importance of authenticity, especially for neurodivergent individuals. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So, for a lot of neurodivergent people, there's this tendency to mask, to kind of suppress our natural tendencies and try to fit into neurotypical expectations. But the presentation encourages us to embrace self-accommodation instead of masking.
So it's about embracing your neurodiversity and finding ways to communicate and work
Yeah.
in ways that feel authentic to you.
Exactly. It's about recognizing your unique needs and advocating for yourself.
I love that. But how does this actually play out in a crunchy conversation? Can you give me a specific example?
Yeah, sure. So let's say, you tend to get overwhelmed in meetings with lots of back and forth discussion. Instead of forcing yourself to participate in a way that feels uncomfortable, you could advocate for a different communication style. Maybe you suggest sending a follow-up email with your thoughts after the meeting.
So it's about finding ways to kind of work with your neurodiversity, not against it.
Exactly. And the presentation even provides some sample dialogue to illustrate how to do this effectively. For instance, you could say something like, I've found that I process information best when I have some time to think things through in writing. Would it be okay if I send a follow-up email with my thoughts after the meeting?
That's brilliant. It's direct, it's clear, and it's respectful of, everyone's needs.
Right. And it's a much more empowering approach than trying to force yourself into a mold that doesn't fit.
Okay, this is all so helpful. It's like you're giving us this whole toolkit of strategies to navigate these conversations more effectively.
And the more tools you have in your toolkit, the more confident and prepared you'll feel.
Okay, so we've talked about staying regulated, being authentic, advocating for our needs, but what about actually navigating the content of the conversation itself? Are there any techniques that can help us stay on track and prevent things from going off the rails?
Absolutely. Active listening is a crucial skill in any conversation, but it's especially important in crunchy conversations. It's not just about hearing the words the other person is saying, but truly understanding their perspective.
So putting yourself in their shoes,
Yeah.
trying to see things from their point of view.
Exactly. And it involves paying attention to their nonverbal cues as well, their body language, their tone of voice, their facial expressions.
Like becoming a detective, trying to decipher all the clues.
Exactly. Active listening also involves asking clarifying questions to make sure that you're not making assumptions or misinterpreting what they're saying.
So if something's not clear, it's okay to interrupt and just say, hey, can you clarify that for me?
Absolutely. It's much better to ask for clarification than to let a misunderstanding fester and potentially derail the whole conversation.
That makes sense. Now, what about those moments when you feel your own emotions starting to rise during the conversation? What are some techniques for kind of staying regulated and preventing yourself from saying or doing something you might regret later?
That's a great question. And one that's, particularly relevant for neurodivergent individuals. The presentation acknowledges that we might experience those more intense emotional responses and offers some really specific strategies to manage those feelings.
Like what?
First, they suggest using sensory tools to help regulate those heightened sensations.
So like a fidget toy or like noise-canceling headphones.
Exactly. Or it might even involve taking a break to engage in a calming sensory activity, like deep pressure or listening to soothing music.
Okay, so it's about finding what works for you and incorporating those sensory supports into the conversation as needed.
Right. Another technique they recommend is using I statements to express your feelings in a way that is assertive but not aggressive. For example, instead of saying, you're making me feel angry, you could say, I'm feeling frustrated because...
So it's about taking ownership of your own feelings and expressing them
Yeah.
in a way that is respectful and constructive.
Exactly, and that can really help prevent the conversation from escalating into a conflict.
Okay, this is all incredibly helpful. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together to create, a more effective and less stressful conversation. So we've talked about starting the conversation, staying on track, managing our emotions. What about wrapping up the conversation? Are there specific things we should do to kind of ensure a positive and productive ending?
Definitely. The presentation emphasizes the importance of summarizing the key takeaways from the conversation and any agreements that were made.
So it's like creating a shared understanding of what was discussed.
Exactly. And it's also helpful to reiterate any action steps that were agreed upon. Who's responsible for what and by when.
It's like creating a mini action plan
Heck.
to make sure that things actually get done.
Precisely. And they also recommend ending the conversation on a positive note, even if it was challenging. This might involve expressing gratitude for the other person's time and willingness to engage in the conversation.
So leaving the door open for, continued communication and collaboration.
Exactly. And even if the conversation didn't fully resolve the issue, you can still acknowledge the progress that was made and express hope for a positive outcome in the future.
This is such sound advice. It's about ending the conversation in a way that feels respectful, productive, and hopeful.
Absolutely. And remember, the more you practice these techniques, the more confident and effective you'll become at handling those crunchy conversations.
This has been such an insightful deep dive into the world of crunchy conversations. I'm feeling so much more prepared and empowered to tackle those challenging conversations, knowing that I have, this framework, this toolkit of strategies, and a whole lot of neuroscience backing me up.
Me too. And remember, you're not alone in this. So many people, especially neurodivergent folks, struggle with these conversations. But with the right support and strategies, you can absolutely become a master of crunchy conversations and build stronger, more fulfilling relationships at work.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else from this presentation that really stood out to you? Anything you'd like to add?
One thing that really struck me was the way this presentation reframed the whole concept of crunchy conversations.
Oh, how so?
Well, instead of viewing them as something to be dreaded or avoided, it really encourages us to see them as opportunities for growth and connection.
That's interesting. I think I usually approach them with the mindset of like, okay, this is a hurdle I have to jump over. Like get in, get out and try to survive.
Right. But imagine if we shifted our perspective and saw these conversations as chances to build stronger relationships, to improve communication, to create a more positive work environment.
Yeah, I'm starting to see what you mean. It's about like embracing the challenge, not just enduring it.
Exactly. And the presentation also emphasizes the importance of self-compassion throughout this process. It reminds us that it's okay to stumble, to make mistakes, to feel overwhelmed at times. What matters is that we learn from those experiences and keep moving forward.
Yeah, that's so important. It's easy to beat ourselves up when things don't go perfectly, but giving ourselves that grace and that understanding is so key, especially when we're navigating these tricky conversations.
Absolutely. And they even suggest celebrating our efforts no matter how small.
Yeah.
Did you manage to initiate a difficult conversation this week? Give yourself a high five? Did you try using one of the techniques we talked about? Awesome. Acknowledge those wins, even the little ones.
I love that. Celebrating progress, not perfection. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of crunchy conversations. I feel so much more prepared and empowered to face these challenges, knowing that I have this framework, these tools, and a whole lot of self-compassion to guide me.
Me too. And remember, you're not alone in this. So many people, especially neurodivergent folks, struggle with these conversations. But with the right support and strategies, you can absolutely become a master of crunchy conversations and create more fulfilling and positive interactions at work.
That's a great message to end on. To all of our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you some practical tools and fresh perspective on those crunchy conversations. Remember, you're capable, you're resilient, and you've got this.
Absolutely. Embrace the crunch and keep learning and growing.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of knowledge and ideas. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep embracing those crunchy conversations, because you never know what amazing things might come out of them.